My husband of 30 years left me, kicking me out of our home and the company. I rushed back to get my things. His new mistress blocked the door. A beggar now? You really are a failure. In a cold storm, I used my last coin to call my high school sweetheart, a billionaire nobody knew about. When his convoy of luxury cars pulled up to the house, he looked at my ex-husband and said 3 words. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The rain hammered against the windshield as I sat in my 15-year-old Honda, staring at what used to be my home. 30 years of marriage, and this is how it ended, with me parked across the street like a stranger, watching the lights glow warmly in the windows of the house I had decorated, cleaned, and loved for 3 decades. My name is Adrian, and at 61 years old, I never imagined I'd be homeless, penniless, and completely alone. 3 weeks ago, my husband Ruben had served me with divorce papers and an eviction notice on the same day. You need to be out by Friday, he'd said, not even looking up from his newspaper, as if I were a tenant who'd overstayed her welcome. The company we'd built together, Henderson and Associates Real Estate, was suddenly his company. The house was suddenly his house. Even my car, apparently, was registered only in his name. How had I been so naive? How had I signed so many papers over the years without reading them carefully? I pulled my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders. The heater in the Honda had stopped working months ago, and I hadn't bothered to fix it. Money had been tight, though I'd never understood why. Ruben handled all our finances, claiming it was one less thing for me to worry about. Now I realized it was one more way for him to control everything. The front door of my former home opened, and she stepped out. Cassandra, 28 years old, blonde, and wearing the silk robe I'd bought for myself last Christmas, the one I'd never had a chance to wear because Ruben said the color didn't suit me. She looked around the neighborhood like she owned it, which I supposed she did now. I took a shaky breath and opened my car door. I had to get my things. My photo albums, my grandmother's jewelry, my mother's china set. Surely Ruben wouldn't keep me from those. They were worthless to him, but everything to me. My legs felt unsteady as I walked up the driveway. Each step brought back memories. Ruben carrying me over this threshold on our wedding day. Teaching our neighbors' children to ride bikes on this very pavement. Hosting barbecues where everyone said we had the perfect marriage. Cassandra noticed me approaching and stepped directly in front of the door, her arms crossed. What do you want? I need to get my personal belongings, I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. My photo albums, some jewelry that belonged to my family. She laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the rain. Ruben said you might try this. He told me not to let you in. Those are my things, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Some of them have been in my family for generations. Your family? She tilted her head, examining me like I was some curious artifact. Honey, you don't have anything. Look at you, standing in the rain like a beggar. You really are a complete failure, aren't you? The words hit me harder than the cold rain soaking through my jacket. A failure. Is that what I'd become? I thought about my life. 30 years of supporting Ruben's business ambitions, managing our home, sacrificing my own dreams so he could chase his, and this was what I had to show for it. Please, I whispered, hating how desperate I sounded. Just my grandmother's ring. It's in the jewelry box upstairs. It's worthless to anyone but me. Cassandra's smile was cruel. Worthless. That sounds about right. She looked me up and down, taking in my worn shoes, my old jacket, my gray hair that I hadn't been able to afford to color in months. You know what's funny? Ruben told me you used to think you were so important, the queen of your little social circle. And now look at you. I closed my eyes against the sting of her words in the rain. She was right. I had thought I was important once. I'd believed that my marriage mattered, that my contributions to our business mattered, that I mattered. How wrong I'd been. The answer is no, Cassandra continued. Now get off our property before I call the police. Our property. My home of 30 years was now theirs. I turned and walked back to my car, my shoes squelching in the puddles that had formed in the driveway. Behind me, I heard the door slam shut with finality. I sat in the Honda for a long moment, my hands shaking from cold and humiliation. I had nowhere to go. The motel where I'd been staying had kicked me out this morning when I couldn't pay for another week. I had exactly $3.67 in my wallet. Not enough for gas, not enough for food, not enough for anything. I pulled my old flip phone from my purse, its screen cracked from when I'd dropped it last week. Most of my contacts were meaningless now. Friends who'd sided with Ruben, business associates who wouldn't take my calls anymore. But there was one number I'd never deleted, even though I hadn't used it in over 40 years. Marcus Chen. My first love. My high school sweetheart. The boy who'd held my hand during senior year and told me he'd love me forever before life pulled us in different directions. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances over the years that he'd done well for himself. Something about hotels, business ventures. But I'd lost touch completely when I married Ruben and moved across the country. Now, sitting in my broken-down car in the rain, with my last few dollars weighing heavy in my purse, I found myself dialing his number. It was probably disconnected. He probably wouldn't remember me. But it was the only call I had left to make. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. Deeper than I remembered, but unmistakably his. Hello? Marcus. My voice cracked. This is Adrian. Adrian Morrison. From Jefferson High School. I don't know if you remember me, but... Adrian. The way he said my name, soft and warm, made tears spring to my eyes. Of course I remember you. Are you okay? You sound... I let out a shaky breath. I'm not okay, Marcus. I'm not okay at all. And then the words came tumbling out. About Ruben, about the divorce, about being thrown out with nothing, about sitting in the rain outside my former home, being called a failure by a woman young enough to be my daughter. Where are you right now? Marcus asked, his voice sharp with concern. I gave him the address and he was quiet for a moment. Don't move, he said finally. I'm coming to get you. Marcus, you don't have to... Adrian, he said firmly. You called me. That means something. Don't move. The line went dead, and I sat staring at the phone. What had I done? What was I expecting from a man I hadn't spoken to in 4 decades? But as I sat there in the cold rain, watching the warm lights of my former home, I realized I had nothing left to lose. 20 minutes later, I noticed headlights turning onto the street. But it wasn't just one car. It was a convoy of black vehicles, sleek and expensive, moving in perfect formation. The lead car was a Bentley that gleamed even in the rain, followed by 2 identical Range Rovers. My heart started pounding as the cars pulled up in front of the house. This couldn't be Marcus. This had to be some mistake. But then the driver's door of the Bentley opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing an expensive coat that probably cost more than my car, his graying hair still thick, his shoulders broader than I remembered, but his walk unmistakably familiar. Marcus Chen. The boy who used to walk me home from school had become a man who traveled with a convoy of luxury vehicles. He walked directly to my car and tapped on the window. When I rolled it down, he looked at me with the same gentle brown eyes I remembered, though now they were lined with concern. Get in my car, Adrian, he said softly. Let's go home. I sat frozen in my Honda, staring up at Marcus through the rain-streaked window. This couldn't be real. The Marcus I knew had been a sweet, earnest boy who worked weekends at his uncle's restaurant and dreamed of maybe opening his own small business someday. This man standing before me looked like he could buy and sell the entire neighborhood without thinking twice. Adrian, he said gently, his voice cutting through my shock. Come on, you're soaked. I glanced toward the house and saw movement in the front window. Curtains twitched as someone peered out, probably Cassandra trying to figure out what was happening. Part of me wanted to stay in my car, to not make whatever this was more complicated than it already was. But Marcus opened my car door himself, extending his hand to help me out. His palm was warm and dry, and when his fingers closed around mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Safety. My things, I said weakly, gesturing to the small duffel bag in my back seat that contained everything I owned now. We'll get your things, Marcus assured me. nodding to one of the men who had emerged from the Range Rovers. The man, tall, professional, wearing an expensive suit under his umbrella, immediately went to retrieve my bag. Marcus guided me toward the Bentley, his hand steady on my back. The interior was warm leather and soft lighting, so different from my cold Honda that it felt like stepping into another world. As soon as I was seated, Marcus slid in beside me and one of his men took the driver's seat. "Sir," the driver said, "should we proceed?" "Not yet," Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on my former house. "Give me a moment." That's when the front door opened again. Cassandra stepped onto the porch, no longer wearing just the silk robe. She'd thrown on jeans and a sweater, probably realizing that whoever had arrived in those expensive cars warranted a different approach than the one she'd used with me. Behind her, I saw Ruben appear in the doorway. Even from the car, I could see the confusion on his face as he took in the convoy of vehicles parked in front of his house. He said something to Cassandra, who shrugged and pointed toward the Bentley. "They're coming out," I said quietly. Marcus nodded, then turned to me. "Adrian, I need you to know something before we do this. I've been following your life from a distance for years. I know what Ruben did to you wasn't right. Following my life?" I looked at him in confusion. "I never forgot you," he said simply. "I hired a private investigator about 10 years ago. I knew you were married, knew you were building a business. I also knew your husband was systematically stealing from you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Stealing from me?" "We'll talk about that later," Marcus said gently. "Right now, I want you to sit here and watch while I have a conversation with your ex-husband." Before I could ask what he meant, Marcus was stepping out of the car. I watched through the rain as he walked up my former driveway with the kind of confidence that comes from absolute certainty. Ruben and Cassandra met him halfway. Even through the closed car windows, I could see the dynamic immediately. Ruben had always been a man who commanded rooms, who made himself the biggest presence wherever he went. But next to Marcus, he looked diminished somehow, smaller. Marcus said something, too quiet for me to hear. Ruben responded, his posture defensive. Cassandra stepped closer to Ruben, probably trying to present a united front, but I noticed she kept glancing at the expensive cars with obvious curiosity. Then Marcus said something else, and Ruben's entire demeanor changed. His shoulders sagged. His face went pale, even in the dim light from the porch. He said something back, shaking his head repeatedly. Marcus remained calm, unmoved. He spoke again, and this time I could see Cassandra grab Ruben's arm, as if to steady him. Whatever Marcus was saying, it was having a profound effect on my ex-husband. Finally, Marcus turned and walked back to the car. When he slid in beside me, his expression was satisfaction mixed with something darker. "What did you say to him?" I asked. Marcus looked directly at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I saw steel in his gentle brown eyes. I said 3 words. "She's with me." That's it? That's all it took. Marcus leaned back in his seat as the driver started the engine. "You see, Adrian, your ex-husband knows exactly who I am. He's known for years that Marcus Chen owns the Chen Hotel Group. What he didn't know until tonight was that Marcus Chen was the boy who loved Adrienne Morrison in high school, and that I've been watching his treatment of you for a very long time." As we pulled away from the house, I turned to look back through the rear window. Ruben and Cassandra were still standing in the driveway, both of them staring after our departing convoy. Ruben looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. "The Chen Hotel Group?" I repeated, the name suddenly familiar. That's you?" Marcus nodded. 43 hotels across the western United States. We just broke ground on our first international property in Vancouver last month. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the boy I'd known with this powerful man beside me. "Marcus, I had no idea. When we lost touch, I always wondered what happened to you, but I never." "I know," he said softly. "I kept tabs on you, but I never reached out. You were married. You seemed happy, at least from the outside. It wasn't until I started noticing irregularities in your husband's business practices that I realized how wrong I was." "What kind of irregularities?" Marcus hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, then handed it to me. Your maiden name was Morrison, right? Your father was James Morrison? Yes, but he died when I was 22, right after I married Reuben. The memory still stung. My father had never liked Reuben, had warned me that there was something off about the man I was planning to marry. We'd argued about it, and he'd died in a car accident before we could make peace. Your father owned Morrison Development, Marcus said gently. It was a small company, but it held the rights to several valuable pieces of commercial property downtown. I looked at the screen of the tablet, seeing documents and contracts that meant nothing to me. I don't understand. Reuben told me my father died in debt. He said the company was worthless. Marcus's jaw tightened. Your father's company was worth approximately $2.3 million when he died. You were his sole heir. The world seemed to tilt around me. That's not possible. Reuben showed me the paperwork. There were debts, creditors. Reuben forged documents, Marcus said quietly. He convinced you to sign over power of attorney during your grief, then systematically transferred all of your father's assets into his own name. The company you two built together? It was built on land that belonged to you. Henderson and Associates exists because Reuben stole your inheritance and used it as seed money. I felt sick. 30 years of marriage, 30 years of supporting what I thought was our dream, and it had all been built on theft. My theft. How do you know all this? I whispered. Because 5 years ago, when I was looking to expand into commercial real estate, I tried to buy some property downtown. During the research process, my lawyers discovered the irregularities in the ownership transfers. Your father's signature on several key documents was forged. The car had stopped moving, and I looked up to realize we were parked in front of a modern glass building that rose into the dark sky like a monolith. A discreet sign near the entrance read, Chen Hotel Group, Corporate Headquarters. Why didn't you contact me then? I asked. Why wait until now? Marcus turned in his seat to face me fully. Because you were still married to him. If I'd approached you 5 years ago, told you that your husband was a criminal who had stolen your inheritance, would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was some crazy ex-boyfriend trying to destroy your marriage? He was right, and we both knew it. 5 years ago, I'd still believed in my marriage, still trusted Reuben completely. I would have thought Marcus was lying, or jealous, or delusional. But now, Marcus continued, now you've seen what kind of man he really is. Now you're ready to hear the truth. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. Everything I'd believed about my life had been a lie. My father hadn't died in debt. He'd left me a legacy that Reuben had stolen. The business I'd helped build had been built with my own money. Even my poverty was artificial, created by a man who had systematically robbed me of everything I was entitled to. What happens now? I asked finally. Marcus smiled, and for a moment I saw the sweet boy I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Now we get your life back, all of it. As we walked into the gleaming lobby of his corporate headquarters, I couldn't help but glance back toward the street, toward the direction of my former home where Reuben and Cassandra were probably still trying to figure out what had just happened. They had no idea what was coming, but something told me they were about to find out. The elevator to Marcus's private office was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. I stood beside him, still trying to process everything he'd told me in the car. My father's company, my stolen inheritance, 30 years of lies. It felt like discovering that my entire life had been someone else's elaborate fiction. Marcus's office occupied the entire top floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. In the distance, I could see the downtown area where my father's properties were located, properties that should have been mine. Sit, Marcus said gently, guiding me to a leather chair across from his desk. I know this is overwhelming. We'll take it one step at a time. He pressed a button on his desk, and within moments, a woman in her 50s appeared with a tea service. She set it down without a word, gave Marcus a meaningful look, and disappeared again. That's Elena, my assistant, Marcus explained as he poured tea into delicate china cups. She's been with me for 15 years. Completely trustworthy. I accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping my cold hands around the warm cup. Marcus, I need to understand something. You said you've been watching Ruben's business practices. What exactly did you find? Marcus opened a file cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a thick folder. When he set it in front of me, I could see my name written on the tab in neat handwriting. Everything's in here, he said. But let me start with the basics. He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like an official document. This is your father's original will. He left everything to you. The company, the properties, even a small trust fund that was supposed to provide you with monthly income. I stared at the document, recognizing my father's signature. But Ruben showed me a different will. One that said my father had debts. Forged, Marcus said simply. Look at this. He pulled out another document, placing it side by side with the first. This is what Ruben presented to the probate court. Notice how the signature is slightly different? The J in James is formed differently. The loops in the M in Morrison don't match. He was right. Even to my untrained eye, I could see the differences now that he pointed them out. But how did he get away with it? I asked. Didn't anyone verify these things? Marcus's expression darkened. Your father died in a car accident on a Friday evening. Ruben filed these papers the following Monday, claiming that you were too distraught to handle the legal proceedings yourself. He presented himself as your devoted husband, taking care of the difficult details so you could grieve. The memory came flooding back. I had been devastated by my father's sudden death, especially since our last conversation had been an argument about Ruben. I'd been so consumed with guilt and grief that when Ruben offered to handle everything, I'd been grateful. I'd signed whatever he put in front of me without reading it carefully. He planned this, I whispered. My father's death was convenient for him. I don't think he caused the accident, Marcus said carefully. But yes, he certainly took advantage of it. Look at this timeline. He pulled out a calendar marked with dates. Your father died on Friday, March 15th, 1991. Ruben filed the forged will on Monday, March 18th. But look at this. He'd already been in contact with several potential buyers for your father's properties. The earliest inquiry was dated March 10th, 5 days before your father died. My blood ran cold. He was planning to steal from me before my father even died. Marcus nodded grimly. It gets worse. After he convinced you to sign over power of attorney, he used your father's properties as collateral to secure business loans. Officially, you were listed as co-owner of Henderson and Associates, but all the actual assets were transferred into his sole name through a series of shell companies. He pulled out more documents, loan applications, property transfers, corporate filings. Each one showed Ruben systematically moving my inheritance away from me, while making it look like we were building something together. For 30 years, Marcus continued, you've been working to build a business that was founded on property that belonged to you. Every success Henderson and Associates had was built on your stolen legacy. I set down my teacup with shaking hands. The house. Our house. Where did the money come from to buy it? Marcus consulted another document. Purchased with proceeds from the sale of one of your father's downtown properties. The deed was transferred to Ruben's name only, despite the fact that the money came from your inheritance. I thought about all those years of believing we were struggling financially, of working extra hours to help make ends meet, of sacrificing my own needs so Ruben could invest in the business, all while he was sitting on millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to me. Why did you wait so long to approach me about this? I asked. You said you discovered it 5 years ago. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights. Because I loved you once, Adrienne. More than I've ever loved anyone. When I found out what he'd done to you, my first instinct was to destroy him. I had the evidence. I could have had him arrested, could have exposed everything, but you didn't. No, because I realized that destroying Ruben wouldn't necessarily help you. You were still married to him. You still believed in your life together. If I'd exposed him then, you would have been collateral damage. You would have lost your home, your business, everything you thought you'd built. But you wouldn't have understood why. You would have seen me as the villain who destroyed your marriage. I realized he was right. 5 years ago, if someone had told me that Ruben was a criminal who'd stolen my inheritance, I would have defended him. I would have thought it was a lie, or a misunderstanding, or some kind of elaborate setup. "So you waited," I said. "I waited and watched. I kept hoping he'd change, that he'd treat you better, that maybe I was wrong about what kind of man he was." Marcus turned back to me, his eyes sad. "But he didn't change. He got worse. And when I heard through mutual contacts that he was planning to leave you, I knew it was time." "What mutual contacts?" Marcus hesitated. "The private investigator I hired to keep track of you also monitored Ruben's activities. We knew about Cassandra 6 months before you did. We knew he was planning to divorce you and leave you with nothing. We also knew something else." He pulled out another file, this one thicker than the first. "Ruben has been having affairs for over 20 years, Adrienne. Cassandra isn't the first, she's just the youngest." The photographs he showed me were like daggers to the heart. Ruben with various women over the years, at restaurants, hotels, conferences. Some of them were faces I recognized, women I'd considered friends. Others were strangers. "Mrs. Patterson from the country club," I said, staring at one photo. "She was at our anniversary party last year." "He's been seeing her on and off for 8 years, Marcus confirmed. "And look at this one." The next photo showed Ruben with a woman I didn't recognize, but the timestamp showed it was from our 25th wedding anniversary weekend. While I'd been home alone, thinking he was at a business conference, he'd been with another woman. "How many?" I asked quietly. "That we know of?" 17 different women over the past 20 years. I felt numb. Not just betrayed, but stupid. How had I missed so many signs? How had I lived with this man for 30 years and never seen who he really was? "There's more," Marcus said gently. "The business is in trouble. Serious financial trouble." "What do you mean?" "Henderson and Associates is about to go bankrupt. Ruben has been using business funds for personal expenses, including supporting several of these women. He's also made some very bad investments and lost significant money in the stock market. The company's debts currently exceed its assets by approximately $800,000. I stared at him in shock. 800,000? How is that possible? "He's been hiding it from you for the past 3 years, moving money between accounts, taking out loans against properties, even borrowing against the company's future earnings. The creditors are starting to circle." "But that means—" I struggled to understand the implications. "It means that when he divorces you and keeps the company, he's not keeping a valuable asset. He's keeping a massive debt. He probably planned to declare bankruptcy after the divorce was final, leaving you with nothing while he starts over with Cassandra." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not only had Ruben stolen my inheritance and cheated on me for decades, but he'd also planned to stick me with the debts while he walked away free. "However," Marcus continued, "there's something he doesn't know." "What?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time that evening, it wasn't a gentle expression. "He doesn't know that I've been quietly buying up his debts. Over the past 2 years, through various shell companies, I've purchased approximately $600,000 of Henderson and Associates' outstanding loans." "Why would you do that?" "Because it means I can call those loans due at any time. It means I own the majority of his debt. And it means that when the time comes, I can force him into bankruptcy on my terms, not his." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Marcus's planning. "You've been orchestrating this for years." "I've been preparing for this for years," Marcus corrected. "Tonight, when you called me, was when everything began." He pulled out one final document and placed it in front of me. "This is a lawsuit I've prepared against Ruben for fraud, forgery, and theft. It seeks to recover your stolen inheritance plus damages and interest. Based on current property values, you're entitled to approximately $4.7 million. $4.7 million. The number was so large I couldn't quite comprehend it. "That's not counting the value of Henderson and Associates itself," Marcus continued. "If we subtract the debts and add the value of the legitimate business assets, the company is still worth roughly $1.2 million. All of which should legally belong to you, since it was built with your stolen inheritance." I looked at all the documents spread across his desk. Years of investigation, planning, and preparation. "You did all this for me." "I did this because it's right," Marcus said simply. And because 30 years ago, I promised I'd always protect you. I may have failed to keep that promise then, but I'm keeping it now. I thought about Ruben and Cassandra, probably still standing in the driveway of my former home, trying to figure out what had just happened. They had no idea that their perfect little world was about to come crashing down. But more than that, I thought about myself. For the first time in decades, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope for a real future. A future where I wasn't struggling to survive, where I wasn't being controlled and manipulated, where I could make my own choices. "What happens next?" I asked. Marcus gathered the documents back into their folder. "Next, we file the lawsuit. We present our evidence to the court, and we get your life back." He paused, then looked at me with those same gentle brown eyes I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "But first, you need to sleep. You need to eat. You need to remember that you're not the broken woman Cassandra saw tonight. You're Adrienne Morrison, and you're about to reclaim everything that was stolen from you." As he said my maiden name, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't Ruben's discarded wife anymore. I was James Morrison's daughter, and it was time to claim my inheritance. I woke up in what felt like a dream. The guest suite in Marcus's penthouse apartment was larger than the entire motel room I'd been living in, with soft Egyptian cotton sheets and a view of the city that stretched to the mountains beyond. For a moment, I forgot where I was and why I was there. Then it all came rushing back. The rain, the humiliation, Marcus's revelations about my stolen inheritance. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," I called, pulling the silk robe Marcus had provided around my shoulders. Elena, Marcus's assistant, entered with a breakfast tray and a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Chen wanted you to know that he's in meetings this morning, but he'd like to see you in his office at 2 o'clock, if that's convenient." "It's Morrison," I corrected automatically, then paused. "Actually, I suppose it's Henderson legally. For now." Elena's smile widened. "Mr. Chen mentioned that might change soon. He also asked me to take you shopping this morning if you're interested. He thought you might want some new clothes before your meetings begin." I looked down at the worn outfit I'd been wearing yesterday, now cleaned and pressed by Marcus's housekeeper. It was the nicest thing I owned, and it was clearly inadequate for whatever was coming next. "I don't have money for shopping," I said quietly. "That's been taken care of," Elena assured me. "Mr. Chen has opened a temporary account for your immediate needs. He said to tell you it's an advance against what's rightfully yours anyway." 2 hours later, I stood in front of a full-length mirror in an upscale boutique, barely recognizing myself. The navy blue suit Elena had helped me select was expertly tailored, making me look confident and professional, rather than like the broken woman who'd begged for her belongings in the rain. My hair had been styled at the salon next door, and for the first time in months, I'd had it colored to cover the gray I couldn't afford to maintain. "You look powerful," Elena said approvingly, like someone who belongs in a boardroom. I did feel powerful, but also strange. It had been so long since I'd dressed for success, rather than simply trying to make my clothes last another year. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who could demand answers, who could fight for what was hers. When we returned to Marcus's office building, he was waiting for us in the conference room adjacent to his office. He'd changed into a fresh suit, and spread across the mahogany table were documents, photographs, and what looked like a detailed timeline of events. "You look beautiful," he said when I entered, and the way he said it made me believe it might actually be true. "Thank you for the clothes," I said, "and for everything else. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Marcus shook his head. "You're not repaying me, Adrienne. I'm returning what should have been yours all along." He gestured to the documents on the table. "I've been refining our strategy this morning. I want to show you exactly how we're going to proceed." He pulled out a chair for me, and I sat down, feeling more prepared to handle whatever came next than I had in years. "First," Marcus began, "we're going to file the civil lawsuit against Ruben for fraud and theft. That process will take time, probably 6 to 8 months before we see a resolution, but we're not waiting for that. He pointed to a stack of papers on the left side of the table. These are the documents to call in the loans I've been purchasing. As of this morning, I own 63% of Henderson and Associates' debt. I can legally demand immediate payment of those loans. What happens when Ruben can't pay? The company goes into bankruptcy, Marcus explained. But here's where it gets interesting. As the primary creditor, I have significant influence over how that bankruptcy proceeds. I can push for the company's assets to be sold to pay the debts. I began to see where he was going. And you'd be in a position to buy those assets. Exactly. But not me directly. You would be. Marcus pulled out another document and placed it in front of me. This morning, I had my lawyers establish a company called Morrison Holdings. You are the sole owner and president. I stared at the incorporation papers, seeing my name listed as the company's head. Morrison Holdings? Your father's company was Morrison Development. I thought it was fitting that Morrison Holdings should be the one to reclaim what Morrison Development built. Marcus's voice was gentle. Through Morrison Holdings, you can bid on the assets when Henderson and Associates is forced to liquidate. With my financial backing, you'll be the highest bidder. The elegance of the plan was breathtaking. Instead of simply suing Ruben and waiting years for a resolution, Marcus had found a way to force him into a corner immediately. But won't Ruben know that Morrison Holdings is me? Marcus smiled. That's the beautiful part. He'll know eventually, but not until it's too late to stop the process. And there's something else. He pulled out his phone and showed me a number. I think it's time we had a conversation with Cassandra. I felt my stomach tighten. With Cassandra? Why? Because I don't think she knows the full truth about Ruben any more than you did. And I think when she finds out, she might become our most valuable ally. Before I could protest, Marcus was dialing the number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Hello? Is this Cassandra? Yes. Who is this? My name is Marcus Chen. I'm calling about Ruben Henderson. There was a pause. You're the man from last night. With the cars. That's right. I was wondering if we could meet. There are some things about Ruben that I think you should know. Cassandra's voice became wary. What kind of things? Marcus looked at me, and I nodded. If we were doing this, we might as well do it completely. Things about his other women, Marcus said simply. And about his debts. Things that affect your future with him. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, Cassandra spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. What other women? I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you meet us this afternoon? Say 4 o'clock at the Fairmont Hotel downtown? The restaurant on the second floor. Yes, I'll be there. After Marcus hung up, I looked at him with mixed feelings. Are you sure about this? Yesterday she was calling me a failure. Today we're going to try to make her our ally? Yesterday she thought she was winning, Marcus said. Today she's going to find out that she's just another victim. People can change when they realize they're not in competition anymore, but on the same side. The Fairmont Hotel was one of the most elegant places in the city, the kind of establishment where Ruben had always claimed we couldn't afford to eat. As Marcus and I waited in the restaurant, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't since high school. What did you say to the woman who'd humiliated you just 24 hours earlier? Cassandra arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, and I had to admit she looked uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. Gone was the confident smirk from the previous night. She'd dressed carefully, a conservative dress and jacket that suggested she was taking this meeting seriously. She approached our table hesitantly, her eyes darting between Marcus and me. I wasn't sure you'd really be here, she said to me. Sit down, Cassandra, Marcus said gently. We have a lot to discuss. She sat, but perched on the edge of her chair like she might need to flee at any moment. Before you say anything, she said, looking directly at me, I want you to know that I'm not proud of how I treated you last night. I blinked in surprise. An apology was the last thing I'd expected. Ruben told me you were bitter about the divorce, that you were trying to make trouble, Cassandra continued. He made it sound like you were being vindictive. And now? I asked. Cassandra's voice dropped. Now I'm starting to think Ruben tells people what he needs them to believe. Marcus leaned forward. What's changed since last night? Cassandra glanced around the restaurant, then pulled out her phone. I found something this morning on his laptop. He left it open, and I saw an email. She showed us the screen, where an email conversation was visible. The messages were between Ruben and someone named D. Martinez. The conversation was brief, but devastating. R. The old situation is handled. Adrian signed the papers and she's out. D. Good. What about the new girl? R. Cassandra? She's useful for now. Pretty, young, doesn't ask questions, but she's not long-term material any more than the others were. D. How long do you think before you're ready to move on? R. Give me 6 months to get the finances sorted, then I'll probably need a change of scenery. Cassandra's hands were shaking as she put the phone down. There have been others, haven't there? Marcus and I exchanged glances. Then Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, a different one from what he'd shown me the night before. 17 that we know of, he said gently. Over the past 20 years. Cassandra went pale. 20 years? But he told me I was the first. He said his marriage was dead, that he'd never cheated before, that I was special. The same thing he told all of them, Marcus said. He opened the folder and showed her some of the photographs, not to be cruel, but to help her understand. Cassandra, you're not the villain here. You're another victim. Tears started forming in her eyes. I left my job for him. I moved across the country. I thought we were building a life together. What did you do before? I asked, my anger toward her beginning to transform into something else. I was a paralegal in Seattle, she said. I had my own apartment, my own life. When Ruben said he wanted me to move here, that we'd get married as soon as his divorce was final, I gave up everything. The parallel to my own story was unmistakable. Ruben had convinced her to sacrifice her independence, just as he'd convinced me to sign over my power of attorney during my grief. Marcus pulled out more documents. Cassandra, there's something else you need to know. Ruben is going bankrupt. The company, the house, all of it is built on debt. He was planning to leave you with nothing, just like he did to Adrian. But the house is mortgaged beyond its value. He owes more than it's worth. Marcus showed her the financial documents. Even if you married him tomorrow, you'd be inheriting massive debt, not wealth. Cassandra stared at the papers with growing horror. He said we were rich. He said the divorce settlement would be minimal because Adrian hadn't contributed anything to the business. Adrian built that business with her stolen inheritance, Marcus said firmly. Every asset Ruben claims to own was purchased with money that belonged to her father. I watched Cassandra process this information, seeing her face transform as the reality sank in. She wasn't the triumphant other woman who'd won the prize. She was the latest mark in a long con game. What happens to me now? She asked quietly. Marcus and I looked at each other. This was the moment that would determine whether Cassandra became an ally or remained an enemy. That depends, I said carefully, on whether you want to help us expose the truth, or whether you want to go down with Ruben when his house of cards collapses. Cassandra wiped her eyes with her napkin, and when she looked up, I saw something new in her expression: determination. What do you need me to do? 3 weeks later, I stood in the marble-floored lobby of the courthouse, wearing a charcoal gray suit that made me feel like the successful businesswoman I was about to become again. Marcus stood beside me, calm and confident, while our team of lawyers organized their briefcases and documents. But the person I was most grateful to have by my side was Cassandra. Over the past weeks, she had become not just an ally, but something I never expected: a friend. She had moved out of my former house and was staying in one of Marcus's corporate apartments while she figured out her next steps. More importantly, she had provided us with information that made our case against Ruben absolutely ironclad. Are you ready for this? Marcus asked quietly as we watched Ruben and his lawyer enter through the opposite doors. I've been ready for 30 years, I replied, and I meant it. Ruben looked haggard in a way I'd never seen before. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. When his eyes met mine across the lobby, I saw something I'd never seen in them before: fear. The past 3 weeks had not been kind to him. Marcus had methodically called in the loans he owned, demanding immediate payment of over $600,000. When Reuben couldn't pay, Henderson and Associates had been forced into emergency bankruptcy proceedings. The company's assets were being liquidated, and Reuben was facing personal bankruptcy as well. But that was just the financial pressure. The real devastation had come from Cassandra. She had agreed to testify about the documents she'd found on Reuben's computer. Not just the email about her being temporary, but financial records that showed he'd been systematically hiding assets from me during our divorce proceedings. She'd also provided recordings of conversations where Reuben had bragged about manipulating me and stealing my inheritance. "He thought I was stupid," Cassandra had told me during one of our strategy sessions. "He thought I was just a pretty face who wouldn't ask questions. But I have a paralegal degree, I know how to read financial documents, and I recorded our conversations because I was planning to surprise him with a scrapbook of our relationship." Instead, those recordings had become evidence of fraud, forgery, and theft. The bankruptcy hearing began with the judge reviewing the basic facts of the case. Henderson and Associates owed approximately $800,000 to various creditors, with Marcus's companies holding the largest portion of that debt. The company's assets were valued at roughly $1.4 million, which should have been enough to pay the debts and leave something over. However, the judge continued, reading from the documents before him, there are serious questions about how this company acquired its initial assets. Reuben shifted uncomfortably in his chair as our lead attorney, David Chen, Marcus's younger brother and one of the best corporate lawyers in the state, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Henderson and Associates was founded using assets stolen from the estate of James Morrison, who died in 1991. Mr. Henderson forged documents to steal approximately $2.3 million from Mr. Morrison's daughter, Adrienne Henderson, who is present in court today." The judge's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Chen." "We have extensive documentation, Your Honor. Handwriting analysis confirms that key signatures on estate documents were forged. We also have testimony from witnesses, including Ms. Cassandra Webb, who was living with Mr. Henderson and can testify to his admissions of guilt." Reuben's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who had clearly not been prepared for the scope of evidence against his client, stood up. "Your Honor, these allegations are unsubstantiated attempts to complicate what should be a straightforward bankruptcy proceeding." "I'd like to hear the evidence," the judge said firmly. For the next 2 hours, David Chen methodically presented our case. The forged documents were displayed on large screens, with handwriting experts explaining the differences between authentic signatures and the forgeries. Financial records showed how Reuben had used my father's properties as collateral for business loans, then transferred ownership of everything into his name through shell companies. But the most damaging testimony came from Cassandra herself. She took the witness stand wearing a simple blue dress and spoke in a clear, steady voice about what she had discovered in Reuben's files. She read from emails where he boasted about handling me and keeping the business in the right hands. She played recordings where he laughed about my naivety and discussed his plans to disappear after the divorce was finalized. "He told me that Adrienne had contributed nothing to the business," Cassandra testified. "He said she was just a housewife who didn't understand finance or real estate. He made her sound like a burden he had carried for 30 years. "And what did you discover about the true origins of the business?" David asked. "That it was built entirely on properties that belonged to Adrienne's father, that Reuben had forged documents to steal her inheritance, and that he had been planning to abandon me the same way he abandoned her, after taking everything and leaving his victim with nothing but debt." Reuben's face had gone from pale to ashen. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, probably advising him that their position was hopeless. The most devastating moment came when David presented evidence of Reuben's other affairs. "Your Honor, the defendant has a pattern of using and discarding women after gaining access to their resources or using them to facilitate his schemes. We have documented 17 different extramarital relationships over 20 years, including several where Mr. Henderson convinced women to provide him with financial support or business connections." "Objection," Reuben's lawyer said weakly. "Relevance? It goes to the defendant's character and pattern of fraudulent behavior. David replied. This is not a crime of passion or a single mistake. This is a decades-long pattern of systematic fraud and emotional manipulation. The judge nodded. Overruled. Continue. When all the evidence had been presented, the judge called for a recess to review the documents. Marcus, Cassandra, and I waited in a small conference room while the lawyers discussed strategy. How do you think it went? Cassandra asked nervously. Better than I dared hope, Marcus replied. David was brilliant. The evidence speaks for itself. I looked out the window at the city below, thinking about how much had changed in just 3 weeks. I wasn't the same broken woman who had been standing in the rain, begging for her possessions. I was James Morrison's daughter, fighting for what was rightfully mine. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge's expression was stern. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, he began, and I find it compelling and credible. The documentation clearly shows that Henderson and Associates was founded using assets obtained through fraud and forgery. Mr. Henderson, do you have anything to say in your defense? Reuben stood slowly, his lawyer beside him looking defeated. For a moment, I thought he might confess, might finally tell the truth about what he had done. Instead, he tried one last manipulation. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the same charm that had once convinced me to trust him completely. I understand that these allegations look serious, but you have to understand the context. Adrienne was grieving her father's death. She was in no condition to handle complex financial matters. I was trying to protect her, to make sure the business would be stable and successful. Everything I did was for our family. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even after everything, all the evidence, all the testimony, all the proof of his lies, he was still trying to paint himself as my protector. I felt something inside me snap. Before I could stop myself, I was standing up. Your Honor, may I address the court? The judge looked surprised. Mrs. Henderson, you're not scheduled to testify, but if you'd like to make a brief statement, thank you. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. For 30 years, I believed the man I married was protecting me. I believed that when he took care of financial matters, it was because he loved me. I believed that when he made decisions about our business, it was because he was wiser and more experienced. I looked directly at Reuben. But protection doesn't involve forging my father's will. Love doesn't mean stealing my inheritance and lying about it for 3 decades. And wisdom doesn't include planning to abandon your wife with nothing but debt while you run away with a younger woman. Reuben's face crumpled. For the first time, I saw him as he really was. Not the confident manipulator who had controlled my life, but a weak, selfish man who had built everything on lies. I trusted you completely, I continued. I signed every paper you put in front of me because I believed we were partners. I worked alongside you for 30 years because I thought we were building something together. But we weren't building anything. You were just stealing from me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for justice. I want what belonged to my father, what should have been mine from the beginning. And I want to make sure that Reuben Henderson never has the opportunity to do this to another woman again. When I sat down, the courtroom was completely silent. Even Reuben's lawyer seemed speechless. The judge cleared his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I've heard enough. He shuffled through his papers, then looked up with a grave expression. I find that Henderson and Associates was indeed founded using assets obtained through fraud and theft. I'm ordering the immediate liquidation of all company assets, with proceeds to be used first to pay legitimate creditors, then to provide restitution to Mrs. Henderson for her stolen inheritance. Reuben slumped in his chair. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. The evidence of forgery and fraud is overwhelming and appears to warrant criminal charges. He looked directly at Reuben. Mr. Henderson, you have 48 hours to vacate the house on Maple Street, as it was purchased with fraudulently obtained funds and must be sold to provide restitution. You should consider yourself fortunate that Mrs. Henderson has shown remarkable restraint in not pursuing the maximum penalties available under the law. As we left the courthouse, reporters were waiting outside. Word had somehow gotten out about the case, and there were cameras and microphones thrust in our direction. "Mrs. Henderson, how does it feel to get your inheritance back?" one reporter called. I paused, thinking about how to answer. "It feels like justice," I said simply. "What will you do now?" I looked at Marcus, who smiled encouragingly. "I'm going to do what my father would have wanted me to do. I'm going to build something real, something honest, something I can be proud of." As we walked away from the courthouse, Cassandra fell into step beside me. "What happens to me now?" she asked quietly. "What do you want to happen?" I replied. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to go back to being a paralegal. I want to use my skills to help people instead of being someone's decoration." Marcus overheard and turned back to us. "Morrison Holdings is going to need a legal department as we expand. We'll need someone with experience in real estate law and corporate documentation." Cassandra's eyes widened. "You'd hire me? After everything?" "You helped us expose the truth," I said. "You chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to stay silent. That's exactly the kind of person I want working for my company." 3 days later, I stood in the driveway of my former house, watching as a moving truck carried away Reuben's belongings. He emerged from the front door carrying a single suitcase, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He stopped when he saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other. "I suppose you're satisfied now?" he said bitterly. "No," I replied. "I'm not satisfied. I'm free. There's a difference." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You always were too good for your own good, Adrienne." "And you," I said quietly, "were never as clever as you thought you were." As his taxi pulled away, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. The house would be sold, the proceeds going toward my restitution. Henderson and Associates would be dissolved, its legitimate assets transferred to Morrison Holdings. But more than that, I was finally free from the man who had stolen 30 years of my life. Marcus appeared beside me, taking my hand. "Ready to go home?" I looked at the house one last time, then at the man who had rescued me from the rain and helped me reclaim my life. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready to go home." 1 year later, I stood in the executive conference room of Morrison Holdings, looking out at the city skyline that now included 3 buildings that belonged to me. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany table where I'd just finished signing the papers to acquire another piece of downtown property, the same property my father had dreamed of developing 40 years ago. "Congratulations, Mrs. Morrison," said David Chen, Marcus's brother who had become my personal attorney. "This acquisition puts Morrison Holdings at $12.7 million in assets." I smiled, still getting used to hearing my maiden name in professional settings. 6 months ago, my divorce from Reuben had been finalized, and I had legally reclaimed my father's name. It felt like shedding the last remnant of a life that had never really been mine. "Thank you, David. And please, call me Adrienne." The door to the conference room opened, and Cassandra entered with a stack of files. She'd been true to her word about returning to paralegal work, but she'd exceeded everyone's expectations. Her experience with Reuben's deceptions had made her particularly skilled at spotting irregularities in contracts and financial documents. "I have the final reports on the Henderson bankruptcy," she said, setting a folder in front of me. "The last of the assets were liquidated yesterday." I opened the folder and looked at the numbers. After paying all legitimate creditors and legal fees, the bankruptcy had yielded approximately $2.8 million in restitution for my stolen inheritance. Combined with the value of my father's original properties and the success of Morrison Holdings over the past year, I was worth more than my father had ever dreamed possible. But more importantly, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in decades. "What happened to him?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Cassandra's expression was neutral. "He's working as a sales associate at a used car lot in Phoenix. The criminal charges were dropped when he agreed to cooperate fully with the restitution process and accept a permanent ban from working in real estate or finance. It was a harsh fall for a man who had once controlled millions of dollars and commanded respect in the business community. But I felt no satisfaction in his misery, only a profound sense of closure. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Marcus entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that had become my favorite part of every morning. "Good morning, ladies," he said, setting 1 cup beside me. "Are we ready for the big announcement?" I took a deep breath, feeling nervous and excited in equal measure. Today was the day we would announce something I'd been planning for months, something that would honor my father's memory while building something entirely new. "I think so," I said. "Cassandra, would you call the staff meeting for 10 o'clock? As she left to gather the Morrison Holdings team, Marcus sat beside me and took my hand. Over the past year, our relationship had developed slowly and carefully. We were both older now, more cautious about matters of the heart, but what we had built together was real and honest in a way my marriage to Ruben had never been. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "It's a big step." I looked at the proposal in front of me. Plans for the Morrison Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would provide legal aid and financial counseling to women who had been victims of domestic financial abuse. It would be funded by the profits from Morrison Holdings and staffed by attorneys and counselors who understood what it meant to have your life stolen from you. "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied. At 10 o'clock, the entire Morrison Holdings staff gathered in our main conference room. It wasn't a large group yet, just 12 employees, but each one had been carefully chosen for their integrity and competence. Many of them were people, like Cassandra, who had overcome their own challenges and understood the value of second chances. I stood at the head of the table, looking at faces that had become as important to me as family. "I want to thank you all for the incredible work you've done this year. Morrison Holdings has exceeded every projection we made, and that's because of your dedication and talent." There were smiles around the table, but I could see they were waiting for whatever announcement I was building up to. "But success in business has always been just part of my father's dream," I continued. "James Morrison believed that when you were blessed with resources, you had a responsibility to help others build better lives. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Morrison Foundation." I explained the foundation's mission and how it would work alongside our real estate business. I watched faces around the table light up as they understood what we were building, not just a profitable company, but something that would make a real difference in women's lives. "Who will run it?" asked Jennifer, our head of acquisitions. "Cassandra has agreed to serve as executive director," I said. "She'll be working with a board of attorneys and financial counselors to help women who found themselves in situations similar to mine." Cassandra blushed but looked proud. Over the past year, she had transformed from the uncertain young woman who'd been manipulated by Ruben into a confident professional who understood both the legal and emotional aspects of financial abuse. "When do we start?" asked Tom, our accountant. "We already have," I said, smiling. "Our first client is a woman named Patricia Williams. She's 63 years old, and her son has been systematically stealing from her by convincing her to sign over power of attorney while she was recovering from surgery. We're going to help her get her life back." The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed the practical details of running both a business and a foundation, but I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From standing in the rain outside my former home, to standing in my own conference room, surrounded by people who believed in the same things I did. After the staff meeting ended, Marcus and I drove to a small restaurant across town for lunch. It was the same place where we'd met with Cassandra a year ago, when she was still Ruben's girlfriend, and I was still his discarded wife. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked as we waited for our food. "Leaving your old life, I mean. Even if that life was built on lies, it was stable, predictable." I thought about his question seriously. There had been moments over the past year when I'd felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of running a company, of making decisions that affected other people's livelihoods. There had been nights when I'd wondered if I was too old to start over, too set in my ways to build something new. But then I'd remember what it felt like to have no control over my own life, to be dependent on someone who saw me as nothing more than a convenient tool for his schemes. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. For the first time in 30 years, I'm living my own life instead of someone else's version of what my life should be. Marcus smiled. Your father would be proud of you. I hope so. I think about him every day, wondering what Morrison Development would have become if Reuben hadn't stolen it. But maybe this is better. Maybe the Morrison Foundation is what he would have wanted all along. Our food arrived, and we ate in comfortable silence for a while. Through the window, I could see the downtown district where my father's original properties had been located. Most of them belonged to Morrison Holdings now, but instead of developing them for maximum profit, we were creating affordable housing and community spaces. There's something I want to ask you, Marcus said after we'd finished eating. I looked up, surprised by the sudden seriousness in his voice. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart skipped a beat, but before I could say anything, he opened it to reveal not an engagement ring, but a key. This is the key to the penthouse apartment in the new Morrison Tower, he said. I was hoping you might want to share it with me. Not as husband and wife. We've both learned to be cautious about legal entanglements, but as partners in every sense that matters. I stared at the key, overwhelmed by the gesture. The Morrison Tower was the crown jewel of our real estate portfolio, a beautiful Art Deco building we'd renovated to house both our corporate offices and luxury apartments. The penthouse was supposed to be my home, but the thought of sharing it with Marcus made it feel like something more than just another property. Are you sure? I asked. We're both set in our ways. I'm 62 years old, Marcus. I've spent the last year learning who I am when I'm not trying to please someone else. Are you ready to share your space with a woman who's finally discovered she can be stubborn? Marcus laughed. Adrienne, I fell in love with your stubbornness when we were 17. I'm not going to start objecting to it now. I took the key, feeling its weight in my palm. Then yes, I'd like that very much. As we drove back to the Morrison Holdings building, I reflected on how much had changed since that rainy night when I'd called Marcus from my broken-down Honda. I'd thought I was reaching out for rescue, but what I'd really been doing was reaching out for the life that should have been mine all along. The car pulled up in front of our building, and I looked up at the gleaming windows that reflected the afternoon sun. The Morrison Foundation would have its offices on the 3rd floor. Morrison Holdings occupied floors 4 through 6, and Marcus and I would live together on the 15th floor, partners in every sense of the word. Ready to go home? Marcus asked, echoing the same question he'd asked me a year ago. Yes, I said, taking his hand. I'm ready. As we walked through the lobby of our building, I caught sight of our reflection in the polished marble walls. We looked like what we were, two people who had found each other again after 40 years, who had built something beautiful out of the ashes of betrayal and loss. At 62, I was finally living the life my father had dreamed of for me. Not just successful, but meaningful. Not just surviving, but thriving. And most importantly, not just existing in someone else's story, but writing my own. The elevator carried us up to our new home, to our new beginning, to the life that had been stolen from me and reclaimed through courage, love, and the unwavering belief that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Behind us, the city stretched out in all directions, full of possibilities I was only beginning to explore. Ahead of us lay years of building the Morrison Foundation, of helping other women reclaim their stolen lives, of proving that sometimes the best revenge is living well. And beside me was the man who had loved me when we were young, who had waited for me when we were separated, and who had helped me become strong enough to save myself when the time finally came. As the elevator doors opened onto our penthouse apartment, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my old life or the beginning of my new one. This was simply the life I was always meant to live. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.